Welcome to page 161 of Anatomy Coloring Book. This is Dr. Stephen Harkins. The reproductive system, the menstrual cycle. We talked briefly in previous pages about the development of the follicle and the development of the corpus luteum, etc. We'll talk more in detail about that here. In general, to start out, there is a little gland called the pituitary gland in the brain, and it releases two hormones related to the anterior lobe, related to the menstrual cycle. It releases follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And what these hormones do is they go to the ovary and they send signals through the blood to the ovaries. And in turn, the cells, this follicle here and here, this body here, in turn, they secrete other hormones. When they're stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, they in turn stimulate other hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And that's indicated here, estrogen and progesterone. And they have effects on the uterus and in perpetuating and maintaining this cycle and preparing the uterus for fertilization. And what they're really affecting is the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus. So here we have what is called the primordial follicle. This is the ovum, the egg, surrounded by one layer of follicular cells that are helping it with its nutrients and providing it the things it needs, the primordial follicle. Then the primary follicle, as you can see here, starts to gain more and more follicular cells surrounding it, whereas there was only a single layer here. The follicle starts to grow, and the egg starts to grow as well. The ovum inside starts to grow as well. Then in this secondary follicular stage, this antrum body, this gap, the space fills with fluid inside, and it starts to separate all these follicles from the actual egg cell. And there's one tiny layer still surrounding it there. Then in the mature follicle, the antrum continues to grow here. And then when pushing the follicular cells way to the outside here and leaving one layer here. And then we have ovulation, where the ovum breaks free. The egg itself breaks free and begins to travel down the uterine tube. And what's left, of course, is this luteal body, this corpus luteum, made of all these leftover follicular cells. And it begins to secrete hormones of its own, estrogen and progesterone. And then if there is no fertilization, if pregnancy does not occur, it turns into what's called a corpus albicans. In other words, it begins to die and degenerates and just fades away. But if pregnancy does occur, it continues to secrete these hormones for the first 3 months of pregnancy and build up the uterus and the uterine wall and the endometrium, and send hormones throughout the body, preparing for pregnancy and nourishing the fetus during the first 3 months of pregnancy. But let's look closer at what happens during those phases, more specifically. Well, the first 5 days of the cycle is called, this is what you think of when you think of menstruation. This is the menstrual part of the cycle, the first 5 days. This is where there is menstrual blood. There's bleeding. There's a sloughing off and a breaking apart of the inner lining of the uterus, of the endometrium. That's because pregnancy did not occur at the time of the last cycle. No pregnancy occurred here. And what happens, what is sloughing off is this uterine lining right here. All what you see there, this with all the uterine lining begins to grow from 1 millimeter thick to 2 millimeters thick to 3 millimeters thick to 4 millimeters to 5 millimeters thick. So this lining grows at 500%, 500 times its normal thickness. And when pregnancy does not occur, this endometrial lining has to go somewhere. It has to go away because a new cycle needs to start. When we talk about the endometrial lining, we're talking about this lining right here in the inside of the uterus. And you can see these blood drops here from this uterine lining breaking down and degenerating. So that's what's happening in the menstrual cycle, in the first 5 days of the menstrual cycle. And that's what we commonly know as menstruation. But after that occurs, it's time to prepare for fertilization again. It's time to prepare for the eventuality that there might be a pregnancy. And so throughout the next cycle, the proliferative cycle, the hormones right here that are going through the body cause estrogen and progesterone. That's E and F here. Estrogen, we'll make that light blue. Estrogen and progesterone begin to cause, these levels of estrogen and progesterone cause the lining, the endometrium, to get thicker again and develop. It's growing again and growing and growing and getting thicker. Look, from here to here, that's an increased thickness. And so this is this area right here, the endometrium, and the inner lining of the uterus begins to proliferate and grow. And so it is called the proliferative phase up until day 14. Okay. But before that happens, the other hormones from the pituitary gland, follicle stimulating hormone, were acting as well. Follicle stimulating hormone was acting on these follicles and causing them to grow and develop. As it was growing and developing, it started to produce, the follicle itself started to produce this estrogen right here, which caused the development, the increase in the lining of the uterus, increase in the endometrium, the development and the proliferation of the endometrium. So it was the follicle stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary gland that stimulated the follicles, that told the follicles then to start stimulating estrogen to cause the lining of the uterus to grow. Right around day 14, we see two big spikes here, one from follicle stimulating hormone, and then the other from a hormone called luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone, LH. And when it spikes, it promotes the bursting of the egg out of the ovary here, ovulation. Because what it does is it promotes turning this follicle into this corpus luteum. And so it's the spiking of luteinizing hormone that creates the ovulation, that stimulates ovulation to occur and creates this new luteal body or corpus luteum. That's luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone in orange. Now, this luteal body here, this corpus luteum here, begins to secrete hormones of its own, estrogen and progesterone. And this secretion of the stimulation from the luteal or the luteal body causes this increase of progesterone. And notice how it corresponds with the increasing thickness of the endometrium. And again, this is preparing the inside of the uterus for fertilization of an ovum. If there is no pregnancy, luteinizing hormone will fall as this corpus luteum turns into corpus albicans and begins to just degenerate away. But there is still hanging out here some follicle stimulating hormone that is starting to prepare already a brand new follicle to start the process all over again. After ovulation, after the proliferative cycle, we entered a secretory cycle, or a cycle of secretion of estrogen by corpus luteum. So that's called the secretory cycle. Also, secretions from the endometrium. That's why it's called the secretory cycle, I suppose. And there was, during the development of the endometrium, the expansion from 1 millimeter thick to 5 millimeters thick, is the development of these arteries, these blood-filled arteries, vascularizing and taking blood to the area, to the inner lining of the uterus. They're called spiral arteries. And so when the corpus luteum stops providing estrogen estrogen here. The endometrial lining starts sloughing off and breaking apart, and these spiral arteries begin to break and disrupt, rupture, and hemorrhage. And that's where the bleeding comes from during the menstruation phase of the menstrual cycle. I may have created some confusion with the secretions from of estrogen and progesterone. The follicle here causing a rise in estrogen, and then the luteinizing the corpus luteum here, continuing that rise in estrogen to help the proliferation of the endometrial wall, these glands in here, and as well as these spiral arteries, the glands secreting through these ducts, and the rise in progesterone on the bottom here, which it also causes. And both of these, the combination of estrogen and progesterone, are very good for the development of this endometrial wall, the thickening of the endometrium, 1 millimeter to 5 millimeters. Now, it is the degeneration into the corpus albicans which causes this drop in both progesterone and estrogen, which causes the sloughing off of this endometrium and into then the bleeding and the hemorrhaging and the destruction of the spiral arteries. Okay, that represents the end of page 161 of Anatomy Coloring Book. This is Dr. Stephen Harkins.